Hi, it's Katrina. Once again, we are venturing into the unknown, exploring the unsolved mysteries of the ancient world that continue to baffle historians and archaeologists alike. Today is Origins Unexplained. These blocks shouldn't exist. The monumental stones at Baalbek don't just seem to defy explanation, they seem to defy all human logic. They are some of the biggest building blocks on the planet, and scientists still don't know how they were made. I think these stones could be more mysterious than the pyramids of Giza. Not a lot of people know about Baalbek, but they should. The ancient city is located in Lebanon, 3,000 feet above sea level in the Bekaa Valley. In Roman times, Baalbek was known as Heliopolis, but its history goes back even further to 7,000 BC. That's according to the evidence that a German archaeological team uncovered in 1898. I want to talk about the stones, but first you need to know about the city's namesake, Baal. It's a name that might strike terror into your heart, and for good reason. Baal was one of the gods denounced in the Bible. But what the Bible doesn't tell you is that Baal was god of the sky, the Phoenician equivalent of Zeus in Greek mythology. According to ancient Phoenician legends, when Baal came down from the heavens to the mortal plane, Baalbek was where he landed. Some people have taken the legend literally, suggesting Baal was not a deity at all, but an alien. People have suggested that Baalbek was built as a landing platform so that the sky god could come and go as he pleased. In essence, the ancient Phoenicians bore witness to aliens so powerful they mistook them for gods. As servants to the gods, the Phoenicians built a massive platform for Baal, aka an alien, to land their spaceship on. It's a suggestion with physical evidence to back it up. The ancient city of Baalbek was built on a platform that seems too big to have been made for anything other than holding a spacecraft. Since the experts haven't been able to figure out what the platform was for, there is lots of room for speculation. Plus, there are the stones. Some of the stones at Baalbek are ridiculously big. These are building blocks that are over 68 feet long, 14 feet wide, and 14 feet thick. They weigh 1,500 tons. The fact they were cut and moved has left scientists stumped for years. I want to convey just how impossibly huge these stones are. In most ancient sites across the world, building blocks didn't go beyond 2 or 3 tons. Even the Romans, with their advanced technology, typically cut 3-ton stones when building monuments. And that's still heavy. Go try to move a 3-ton block with some ropes and some Roman muscle. It's tougher than you think. Yet the stones at Baalbek are 500 times heavier. This mystery gets more and more confusing the deeper you search. One of the big issues historians have had when researching Baalbek is that its huge platform isn't mentioned anywhere in Greek or Roman texts. Even though it's the only known place where such a monumental thing has been built, there is no note of it in the historical documents. The Romans and Greeks wrote everything down, yet they chose to ignore the Baalbek platform? Seems a little suspicious. Baalbek has also been home to many civilizations over the years. Before it was the cult city of Baal, it was used by the Egyptians as a cultic center for worshipping the god Ra. Biblical archaeologists have even connected the ancient city of Baalbek to the city of Baalgad. In the book of Joshua, Baalgad is mentioned as being in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. The book says that Joshua took all the land, including Baalgad, and captured all of their kings and struck them and put them to death. The Dream Stela, Mystery at the Sphinx. Did you know there is a humongous stone tablet between the front legs of the Great Sphinx of Egypt? Not many do, yet it is hugely important. The big tablet of stone is something known as a stela, sort of ancient billboard. Rulers would commission a stela after something important, like a military victory. It would then be carved with the details of that victory to celebrate it. But stelae could be for anything, from a royal proclamation to the commemoration of a queen's passing. The one between the Sphinx's front paws is called the Dream Stela. On the top part is King Thutmose IV, who ruled during the 18th dynasty between roughly 1401 and 1391 BC. He can be seen offering something to the Sphinx, as if the Sphinx were a god. Stelae are awesome because the inscriptions detail exactly what the point of the stone tablet was. The text beneath the offering scene describes how Thutmose IV fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx after a hunting expedition. In his sleep, the god Harmachis appeared to Thutmose and promised to make him king. In return, Thutmose IV needed to free the Sphinx from its sandy prison. That's where the text breaks off, leaving the last part of the story a mystery. The dream stela implies that before Thutmose became king, the Sphinx was engulfed by sand. It would have looked a lot like this, the picture taken in 1928 by Donald McLeish. In the early 20th century, the Great Sphinx was still buried in the sand. But wait a minute, Thutmose ruled Egypt 3,400 years ago. Archaeologists believe the Sphinx was built 4,500 years ago. The dream stela seems to suggest that in the course of only 1,000 years, the Sphinx was so neglected that it became buried under the desert. There are a lot of experts who believe the Sphinx is older than archaeologists are telling us. For it to have been completely swallowed by the desert, so much so that Thutmose freed the monument just to be crowned king, maybe it was indeed older. Maybe the Sphinx had already been around when the pyramids were built. Perhaps it had been covered in the sand for thousands of years before the pharaohs found it. And now for number 9, but first, it's shout-out time! I want to give a huge thank you to Mildred Laware and Albert Gilmore in Canada for supporting this channel. Thank you so much for watching! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. The mystery of the Irish giants. In a recent video, I mentioned briefly that there were giants living in Ireland in the 1700s. I didn't go into much detail, but now we can! You need to know about the real biological giants that used to live on this planet. What I'm about to tell you is true. It's not a conspiracy and it's not a theory. In the 18th century, Irish giants made a living by exhibiting themselves across Europe. They would tour in circuses as the main attractions. You could pay money to stare up into the face of a man who stood 8 feet tall. Cornelius MacGrath was born in 1736. He died in Dublin in 1760 at the incredible height of 7 feet 5 inches. He was not in the best of shape. Cornelius's skeleton was exhibited with permission from Trinity College Dublin in 1902. When Professor D.J. Cunningham analyzed his skeleton, he found that Cornelius had been decrepit, his knees had been in poor condition, and he'd been almost blind. The same year that Cornelius died, Patrick Cotter was born. Patrick grew to be the first of only 12 people in modern medical history who stood at a verified height of 8 feet. He died in Bristol in 1806 at the age of 46. In 1972, Patrick's bones were exhumed and examined. Sure enough, he was a real certified giant. Charles Byrne was born in 1761 in the small village of Littlebridge. He was only 1 year younger than Patrick. And Charles was also likely related to the Knipe twins, who were also giants from a nearby village. I don't know what was going on in Ireland, but someone's genes had gotten into the gene pool and were churning out biological giants by the dozen. Charles stood an incredible 7 feet 8 inches. Charles traveled to London in April of 1782, where he became an instant celebrity. But being a giant has its flaws. Charles' health was terrible and rapidly declined. It was reported that Charles started drinking heavily to cope with the physical pain of being a giant. Just 1 year after he arrived in London, he died at the young age of 22. What happened next was diabolical. His body was stolen from its grave and sold to a demented surgeon named John Hunter. John put Charles's dead body on display. Then later, in the 1900s, John's skeleton was examined by scientists. A team of surgeons examined Charles Byrne's skull and confirmed that he had an enlarged pituitary fossa. In other words, he had a tumor in his pituitary gland that caused an excess of growth hormones. Charles suffered from a condition we all know today as gigantism. In 2009, Professor Marta Corbonitz extracted a sample of Charles' DNA. The plan was to get to the bottom of this seemingly random explosion of giants in 18th century Ireland. The professor found that Charles had an AIP mutation. His mutation isn't all that unusual in the Irish bloodline. 54 carriers of it were identified in 2010. People are still carrying the giant G mutation in their very DNA. Genetic scientists did even more digging and made a revolutionary discovery. The Irish carriers of the AIP gene can trace their ancestry to a single person. The progenitor of the Irish line of giants lived roughly 1,500 years ago. But what does all this science mean? Is it as simple as a single mutation spreading? Was there one giant in Ireland in 500 AD who spread his genes like Genghis Khan? It's possible, but it's also possible that the Irish giants and their mutated genes come from much, much further in the past. Irish folklore is rich in tales of giants. Giants supposedly built the legendary Giant's Causeway in County Antrim. Perhaps giants have been in Ireland since, I don't know, the days before the flood, when the biblical Nephilim ruled the world. There are a lot of other giants that I haven't even mentioned, like the Portrush giantess. In 1696, James Paris Duplessis mentioned meeting a woman in London who stood 7 feet tall. When James asked about her origin, the giantess claimed she was born on the Isle of Portrush in Ireland. In 1684, King Charles II had a visit from Edmund Malone, yet another Irish giant who stood 10 feet tall. I could go on like this for way too long. Patrick Murphy, Hugh Murphy, James Kirkland, James MacDonald, these were all Irish giants who would have looked perfectly at home in Goliath's family Christmas photo. The fortress that changed history. Archaeologists have found what might just be the oldest fortress in the world. The fortress dates back 8,000 years. It's located in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. Start at the very beginning. In 6000 BC, a group of hunter-gatherers built a defensive complex near the Amya River. It was an impressive feat considering nobody else in the world had ever built a fortress before. There have been other structures found that are older, but never a fortress. This discovery is challenging the traditional views of hunter-gatherer lifestyles. If a fortress had been built here, a fortress could have been built anywhere. Maybe hunter-gatherers weren't as nomadic as anthropologists and historians have been telling us. The fortress is not in very good shape anymore, as I'm sure you can imagine. Nothing of it is left except for the ancient remains of wood palisades and the depressions where huts once stood. Archaeologists have done their thing, though, piecing together what the ancient fortress looked like before it was destroyed. What they found is a chilling reminder of just how human society has always functioned. The site is divided into 2 sections. Archaeologists identified the fortress itself, called Amya I, with evidence of human habitation. There were people living in the fortress, which was protected by a defensive perimeter of wooden stakes. These were huge logs that were sharpened into spikes and driven into the ground. Outside the ring of spikes is Amya II, secondary site. It appears to have been made of primitive huts. According to Colin Greer from Washington State University, this is blatant evidence of a hierarchical structure. Even 8,000 years ago, society was divided between the haves and the have-nots. There were the noble members of society living within the protection of the fortress, and then there were the serfs and the peasants living in a shanty village of huts outside the protection of the spiked wall. It's crazy that this was happening so long ago, before civilization even started. Colin Greer said the architectural format speaks of social inequality. The fortress is proof that property ownership and the wealth gap have been around since the dawn of time, or in Colin's own words, since we became human. Aside from that grim bit of evidence, the fortress is amazing. Archaeologists said it was built centuries before any comparable enclosure in Europe. Something was happening in western Siberia that pushed human ingenuity forward. The fortress has been compared to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Could these 2 ancient places be linked? Could the Siberian fortress and Göbekli Tepe be remnants of a pre-flood civilization? Linear A. Scientists still can't decipher the ancient language of the Minoans. They've been trying to do it for centuries, but just can't figure it out. If they ever do break the code wide open, history could be changed forever. The Minoan language has the most boring name. I'm just going to come out and say it. The name could be improved. It's called Linear A, and it's one of the oldest known languages in the world. The Minoans get their name from the mythical king Minos. They lived on the Greek island of Crete during the Bronze Age, first developing from a primitive Neolithic culture about 5,100 years ago. They went from being barbaric Stone Age cave folk to building complex urban settlements. By 2000 BC, The Minoans were flourishing as a sophisticated society. After 1450 BC, they started to mix their culture with the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. That proved to be their downfall. Their cultures mixed and mingled until the Minoans became indistinguishable from the Mycenaeans. Then there was a great disaster. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age civilization collapsed. The island of Crete was destroyed, its coastal settlements abandoned, and its palaces left in ruins. Scientists don't know what happened, but they would if they could read Linear A. There are over 1,400 Linear A inscriptions that can't be read. The whole history of the Minoan civilization is written down on clay tablets, everything from its creation to its destruction. But until scientists can translate their language, the Minoans will remain a convoluted mystery. It's one of the biggest thorns in the side of historians, especially since they have already deciphered Linear B, the language used by the Mycenaeans on the mainland. It was successfully translated for the first time in the 1950s. Linear A was used on the island of Crete, Linear B on the mainland. Then when the two civilizations started to hybridize after 1450 BC, Linear A was abandoned for Linear B. There is almost definitely a link between the two languages, but scientists just haven't found it yet. Though it's not for lack of trying. As we speak, scientists around the world are trying to make sense of the bizarre symbols on the Minoan clay tablets. And believe me, the symbols are bizarre. Take a look at this image from Cambridge University thanks to Dr. Esther Salgarella. It's a tablet that was found at Agia Triada and has 19 signs on it. You can certainly see why researchers are having such a difficult time figuring them out. Maybe they can use AI. All roads lead to the sea. Apparently, all roads lead into the sea. At least they do on the mysterious Malden Island. This small and isolated island in the Pacific Ocean holds a secret I'm not sure the outside world is ready for. It's only 15 square miles, a tiny island with nobody living on it. The only people who visit Malden Island are the yachters who stop by on their journey through the Pacific. Nobody is even allowed to live on the island these days because it's a protected breeding ground for dozens of bird species. But get this, the island used to be populated. It's covered in ancient ruins that belong to an unknown civilization. It's baffling to imagine that anyone ever lived on Malden Island. There isn't a single drop of fresh water to be found. It's also very low, the land not rising any more than 33 feet above sea level. You could get washed right off the island by a particularly angry wave. It's not somewhere I would suggest settling down to start a civilization. Did I mention it's isolated? Malden Island is 4,000 nautical miles from South America and 1,530 nautical miles from Honolulu. You're not going to reach the island in your department store kayak. Here's what I can tell you about its history. In 1825, Lieutenant Charles Robert Malden discovered the island aboard the HMS Blonde. He and a naturalist on the crew explored it, finding what appeared to be ruined temples and megalithic monuments. How cool would it be to discover a deserted island and come across the remnants of a lost society? I can't think of a more exhilarating adventure. But unfortunately, explorers in the 19th century were mainly concerned with things that could make them money. In the 1860s, an Australian company moved onto Malden Island and started collecting guano left behind by bats. This continued for 70 long years. That's an awful lot of guano. Right before the guano harvesting ended in the 1930s, a team of anthropologists from the British Museum in Honolulu visited the island to inspect the ruins. The lead anthropologist was Kenneth Emery, who came up with a very interesting theory. Kenneth believed the temples and other ruins were built by a small Polynesian population. Kenneth said they likely found the island, lived there for a few generations, and then moved to somewhere else. This mysterious population could have come from Tonga or Samoa. Other members of the group may have continued migrating west, landing on other islands like Tahiti, the Marquesas, and Hawaii. It's a sound theory that isn't hard to believe. People did migrate across the Pacific Ocean, starting little societies on the islands they came across. But not everything is as it seems. There may have been a much older human civilization living on Malden Island. The Black Book of Magic. Icelandic sorcerers loved books of black magic. They actually had several. This black book of ancient sorcery was the Graskina, or Gray Skin. The book had 2 volumes. The first volume was written using the standard Roman alphabet. It contained bits and pieces of magic from around the world. The second part of the book is a little more mysterious. It was written in coded runes, impossible to read unless you already knew how to break the code. The second section of the book had to be more safely secured because it contained real black magic spells. Spells that could presumably cause significant damage if wielded by the wrong hands. Unfortunately, there is no surviving copy of this nefarious book of corrupt magic. Historians don't even know if it was real or a figment of old Icelandic storytelling. What do you think? Could Iceland have produced dark warlocks who learned spells from cursed books? Let me know in the comments. The missing trees on Easter Island. Scientists cannot make up their minds about what happened on Easter Island. Was it deforestation that brought an end to the ancient island civilization? Or was it the arrival of Europeans, with the islanders being sold into slavery? Then again, maybe they were brought down by a plague of rats. Rapa Nui is the true name of Easter Island, its coastline guarded by massive stone statues known as moai. It only got its name because of Jacob Roggeveen, the Dutch navigator who landed on the island on Easter Sunday in 1722. If Jacob's boat had arrived one day later, the island most likely would have been named something entirely different. But anyway, the culture on Easter Island used to be thriving. The evidence is in the statues. There are more than 800 moai dotting the island like huge gray hulks. Most of them were built between 1400 and 1650. They also weigh several tons each, with some of them towering more than 30 feet high. Keep in mind that the moai aren't just heads. They do have bodies, and they even used to have hats. For some reason that scientists have never understood, many of the statues were buried up to their necks. Around 1350, the population reached its peak at 4,000 people. Then the population remained stable until Europeans arrived with Jacob in 1722. By 1877, there were only 111 people left. The Rapa Nui were about an inch away from going extinct. So what happened here? You might notice that Easter Island doesn't have a single tree on it, but it used to. Easter Island was covered in palm trees for more than 30,000 years. The evidence has shown that just before Europeans arrived, all the wood was harvested. The prevailing theory is that the islanders were so obsessed with making more statues that they cut down every single palm tree in order to move the humongous stones. But there is no real evidence that the people of Easter Island cut down every tree on the island. It doesn't really make sense that indigenous people living there would suddenly get rid of all the trees. Perhaps there was a plague and all the trees died. Another theory is that the rats stowed away on the Polynesian canoes and ate and destroyed the trees after landing. The rats also limited the ability of the East Island palm to reproduce by eating its seeds. But in any case, the loss of all the trees seems to have led to disaster. Is this Jesus' house? Archaeologists think they may have found the very house where Jesus Christ grew up. I know it can be nostalgic to visit your childhood home, but this is the childhood home of the Messiah, the Son of God. Researcher Ken Dark from the University of Reading is the one behind this new discovery. He claims that after over a century of archaeological excavations at the Nazareth convent site in Israel, the evidence points in one direction and one direction only. The convent was built on the ruins of Christ's childhood home. Ken Dark has a huge amount of experience backing him up. His career spans more than 30 years. He's been investigating Nazareth since 2004. He and other researchers identified a structure that was built around the time that Jesus Christ supposedly lived 2,000 years ago. Did you know that Nazareth has one of the highest Muslim populations of any city in Israel? It may be one of the most popular sites of Christian pilgrimage in the world, but the demographic has changed a lot since Jesus' time. Around his birth in 30 AD, Nazareth was part of Galilee. When he began his ministry, it was in this area that he started performing miracles and gathering apostles. In 1881, a group of French nuns arrived in Israel and established the Sisters of Nazareth convent. They built their convent over a site that had already been known since the 7th century. For over 1,000 years, the people of Nazareth had believed the ruin was the house of Mary and Joseph, the place where Jesus was raised as a boy. The ruin was partially rebuilt by the Crusaders and then destroyed again in the 13th century. Ken Dark's excavations have revealed a courtyard, plus the doors and windows of the original house, and an ancient rock tomb and a forgotten Byzantine church. It's unlikely archaeologists will ever find an inscription saying Christ was here, so they'll never prove it was his house beyond a shadow of a doubt. But what do you think? Is there enough proof to certify this as Jesus Christ's childhood home? All Roads Lead to the Sea, Part 2. There are 21 archaeological sites spread across Malden Island, a surprisingly large number for such a small place. There are temple platforms, graves, and residential structures. Kenneth Emery believed there was a maximum of 200 people on the island, so it would have been quite cozy. But then why, if there were so few people, did they see it necessary to build a network of roads? Radiating from the center of the island is a complex system of roadways made from huge basalt slabs. These roads fit together perfectly, like sliding together pieces of a puzzle. It's this next part that's going to shock you. The roads don't lead to anywhere that makes sense. Some of the roads start at the decaying temples, and some roads link the temples, but most lead into the ocean. The roads cross the island, hit the beach, and disappear under the waves. What's going on here? There are also strange stacks of stones scattered across the island that sort of look like tiny cairn pyramids. And this isn't the only place in the Pacific where such enigmas have been discovered. 1,000 miles to the south, on Rarotonga Island, there is a paved road leading into the ocean. On the island of Pohnpei, 3,400 miles away, there are similar tiny cairn pyramids connected by ancient paved paths. Researcher Mitch Williamson suggested the culture responsible for building the roads is at least 50,000 years old. Mitch said the entire landmass was once above water, supporting a huge civilization. This was like Atlantis on steroids. The roads didn't originally lead into the water. The idea Mitch put forward is that the Pacific Islands were once connected by an entire continent. When that continent sank, the road network was destroyed. Only bits and pieces of the continent are left, floating in the ocean as tiny isles. After the guano harvesting was over in the 1930s, Malden Island was abandoned until 1956. That was when the UK used it for testing the H-bomb. They almost blew the island to smithereens. Nowadays, it is so remote and difficult to reach that barely any archaeologists bother trying to study it. The island could offer proof of a pre-flood, antediluvian human civilization before a recorded history. But to find that proof, someone needs to pony up the cash and start looking on the sea floor. King John's ruined palace. One of the most mysterious ruins in England is a palace in the middle of Sherwood Forest, the legendary stomping ground of Robin Hood. The ruins are 800 years old, usually home to a few dozen sheep grazing on the wild grass. It's called King John's Palace, even though King John only ever spent 9 days in the palace. It also isn't a palace, but technically a hunting lodge. Historians believe King John's father, Henry II, was the man responsible for commissioning the royal retreat. It was meant as a place of solitude, somewhere that could accommodate the King and Queen of England after a long and tiresome hunt in the forest. One of the most popular things to do in the Middle Ages if you were an English king was to go on a royal retreat. You would take a bunch of your pals, some of the nobility, your queen and her ladies. You'd get a few hunting dogs and go to your rural lodge in the forest. Then you'd hunt some boar or maybe some elk, and after you would go back to the lodge and relax. It was the medieval equivalent of hanging out at a ski resort or by the lake for the weekend. This sort of thing fell out of favor in the 16th century. By 1525, kings weren't going on hunting retreats anymore. King John's palace in Sherwood Forest was neglected and fell into ruin. Soon, nobody could remember who the palace was built for or what the point of it was. In maps from the 18th century, the ruin was known only as king's houses. Today, there are only 3 lonely walls standing in what was originally a great hall big enough to hold a royal entourage. The mystery here isn't so much the palace, but its namesake. Bad King John went down in history as one of the worst kings ever. He ruled England from 1199 until his death in 1216. Over those 17 years, he lost most of the French lands that the English had fought so hard to get. His incompetence, cruelty, and selfishness were so legendary that the whole country turned against him. John's nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that was supposed to bring peace between John and the powerful barons. Then he died of dysentery. Nobody knows what King John was doing in Sherwood Forest or how long he stayed at the family lodge. If the myths are to be believed, he was down there duking it out with Robin Hood. Who do you think was the worst king in all of human history? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching! Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for more videos from the channel.
Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
The Murud Janjira. The Murud Janjira is an ancient fort in India steeped in history and mystery. These days, it's a national tourist hotspot, but in the past, it protected locals from attacks perpetrated by both the British and the Portuguese. It goes all the way back to the 15th century, with its origins being quite simple. The fishermen who lived in the area, people whose lives depended on fish from the sea, built a wooden fortress on some coastal rocks to protect themselves from pirates. That was a pretty serious problem back then, and this small wooden fortress out on the coast was great protection. It made the pirates think twice before they attacked. Over the years, the fortress was improved. Turrets were installed, huge bastions were erected, and cannons and guns were placed to rain fire down on sea invaders. It's believed that at one point, the fortress had at least 572 cannons. It was an almost indestructible island of stone and gunpowder. They could shoot in any direction with more force than any ship could defend itself against. But after so many years as a powerful blockade, the Murud Janjira fort is not the wonderful structure it was long ago. Out of the 572 cannons, there are only 3 left standing. Other attractions at the fort include a royal palace, mosques, houses of noblemen, stables, granaries, and underground tunnels. Many of these structures are connected, and you can also see freshwater tanks that sustain the residents for long periods of time. Idanre Hill. Idanre Hill is a tiny, invisible village in the Nigerian state of Ondo. But just by looking at pictures of this place, you would never think it was in West Africa. It looks like something out of a fantasy, with one of the strangest and yet captivating landscapes in the world. This is because the town was built in the middle of a collection of giant boulders called the Idanre boulders. These are enormous stones of an igneous batholith formed over 500 million years ago. Across the grassy landscape, they rise like smooth mountains and disappear into the clouds. But that's just the landscape. The history here is equally fascinating. The people who live amongst the boulders, mists, and grassy valleys of Idanre Hill did so for thousands of years in complete secrecy. It wasn't until the 1800s that they were contacted by Western civilization. They were perfectly untouched, living simplistic lives in a remote region of Africa. Being surrounded by impassable mountains had made them somewhat impervious to attack. They had lived in their village in peace and tranquility until about 200 years ago. Then they were invaded by the modern world. The native Yoruba community who live in Idanre Hill worshipped gods based on the huge Idanre boulders until the 1800s. But they don't worship their earthly idols any longer, thanks to Christian missionaries in 1894, who basically eradicated all previous belief systems. Most people here are Christian now, though they do still keep some of their traditions. Aztec floating gardens. In Mexico City, a mysterious Aztec home has been discovered. The ruins of this residential dwelling are over 800 years old, constructed near the last days of the Aztec Empire. It was discovered by researchers with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History in the Centro neighborhood. Workers were modernizing the area, adding electrical power substations, when they came across the unbelievable ruins. The abode spans over 4,300 square feet. It was built sometime between 1200 and 1521. Based on that time frame, experts are confident the house was right on the border of two major neighborhoods in the capital city of Tenochtitlan. But here's what's really fascinating. The entire area today seems moderate enough, with simple houses, businesses, tangles of electric cords overhead, and cars honking in the streets. But 800 years ago, the neighborhood was rich with waterways and nature. The archaeologists discovered a jetty where boats would have loaded and unloaded cargo. The house had its own dock and probably would have been at the edge of a lake or a city canal. And that's not all the archaeologists found. Underneath the floor of the house, they discovered funerary vessels, the remains of several infants, as well as tools, and an enormous stone statue. They also discovered evidence that after the Spanish invasion of the city, this house, which probably belonged to someone of great wealth, was transformed into a public bathhouse. The team uncovered leftovers of bathroom floor tiles, bulky pipes, and a drainage system, along with secure concrete plates, thermal resources that were exposed to high temperatures, and European building materials. First, it was a person's home, then the Spanish turned it into a spa. The medieval Outer Hebrides. An incredibly rare medieval site was just discovered in Scotland, in the Outer Hebrides. Water engineers were digging up a field to lay some new pipe on the Isle of Lewis when they found some ancient ruins. They came across pits, post holes, and stone remnants of what appears to have been a sheep management facility. The researchers also discovered over 100 scraps of pottery, fish bones, and other unidentified animal remains. According to archaeologist Alistair Rees, the site probably dates back to about the 14th century. This was when the most powerful rulers of northern Scotland were being deposed. The region of the Outer Hebrides was shrinking, and the people were leaving. Then, in 1493, the great John MacDonald II had his land seized by the tyrannical James IV of Scotland. Because of the turmoil that was happening in this part of Scotland between 600 and 400 years ago, not much from that time remains. There is almost no physical evidence of the medieval period in the Western Isles. That's what makes this discovery so rare. We don't actually know what the medieval site is. Judging by the animal bones and the size, it was probably some kind of sheep farm. But nobody has any idea who lived here, if they did indeed raise sheep, or why the place was abandoned. Gabal el-Haridi. Gabal el-Haridi is without a doubt one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the Sohag region of Egypt. Material has been found here from the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, from the days of occupation by the late Roman Empire, and even from the Coptic period. The Sohag region of Egypt has been occupied ever since about 2700 BC, for about 5,000 consecutive years. The most recent season of excavation saw researchers uncover a mysterious mud brick tower. They believe the tower, which was erected overlooking the Nile River and directly beside the major thoroughfare leading into the region, was a guard tower. The mud brick structure was probably occupied by guards who watched day and night for anyone moving up the road. Then they could bully travelers for money, saying it was taxes, and they could keep a register of everyone entering their part of Egypt. This was during the Ptolemaic dynasty under the rule of Ptolemy III, between 246 and 222 BC. There have been all kinds of other amazing discoveries here as well. The team also came across a temple built at the same time as the tower. It's one of the most splendid temples in this part of the country, dedicated to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Isis is one of the main characters in the Egyptian mythos, resurrected by Osiris to give birth to the great god Horus. Plus, over 85 tombs have been found in the area carved into the side of a mountain. There are so many tombs and burials and mummies hiding underground that researchers have barely scratched the surface at Sohag. Bakoni ruins. The Bakoni ruins in South Africa, in the hills of the Mpumalanga province, were probably once part of a large settlement built by the Bakoni people in the 16th century. That would make them only about 500 years old. Some historians believe the ruins are much older, with some radical theories claiming them to be as old as 250,000 years. That's quite a difference of opinion, but nobody has ever been able to properly date the ruins. Hardly anything remains of whatever was once standing here. The ruins are nothing but the remnants of walls forming a crude labyrinth. According to Professor Peter Delius from the University of Witwatersrand, the Bakoni people of South Africa practiced advanced agriculture and had sophisticated technological know-how. They altered the landscape to better manage their livestock and enhance their agricultural yields through irrigation in the grasslands. Researchers don't know exactly when they were doing all of this. The theory of them being 250,000 years old is not a realistic theory. It would mean that Paleolithic humans were building structures in this part of the world when everywhere else they were living in caves, living primitive lives. The Bakoni ruins remain a mystery, since we don't know when they were made, what purpose they served, or even if they were part of some great lost city of South Africa. Researchers believe it's possible to save the ancient sites if the government invests more in the tourism expansion industry. It will not only preserve the Bakoni ruins, but also make the residents surrounding them aware of their existence. Protecting and restoring the ruins could also create tourism prospects and boost the local economy. Underground Turkey. An archaeological excavation in Turkey has revealed what researchers say could be the largest underground city on Earth. A mysterious cave was discovered in the province of Malden, and within that cave, researchers found passageways leading deep underground, a subterranean maze of water wells, food silos, mysterious altars, and dwellings dating back to the 2nd century AD. Gani Tarkan from the local Malden Museum, the lead excavator on the project, told news sources that the region had been inhabited in solitude for 1900 years. He believes the underground city was first built as a hiding place where early Christians could escape persecution. But as more and more families accepted Christianity, more people moved into the underground city and it flourished. Then, after several hundred years, when Christianity became widespread and mainstream, the city kept on being used because it was already so vast. What researchers don't know yet is why the city was abandoned or how everyone forgot about it. The tunnels were in use until just a few decades ago by the looks of things, and yet everyone forgot it was there. It's one of over 200 ancient underground settlements in Turkey, but by far the biggest. Researchers say it could have held up to 70,000 people, more than most common cities in North America, and all underground, deep in the dirt, and far from the sunlight of the world above. Zeus's temple in Egypt. In Greek mythology, Zeus was the god of gods. He was the lord of the sky, the omnipresent king of thunder and lightning, who lived on Mount Olympus and looked down on all the lowly humans below. But what many people don't realize is that Zeus's influence went far beyond the borders of Greece. And just recently, a temple dedicated to the most famous Greek deity in history was discovered in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. The mysterious temple was made in honor of Zeus Cassios, a somewhat unique version of the Greek god. This version of Zeus was more closely connected to Mount Cassios than Mount Olympus. This mountain, which is on the border of modern Syria and Turkey, is connected to the mythical battle which took place between Zeus and the great monster Typhon. Zeus won the battle using his lightning bolt and prevented Typhon from taking over the cosmos. And because the mountain, known today as Jebel Akra, is frequently besieged by thunderstorms, it makes sense that the ancient people of the region saw it as having ties to Zeus. The temple was identified by Egyptian archaeologists, but it was no easy feat. It's utterly destroyed, with its huge pink granite pillars broken in pieces, probably from an earthquake. Researchers found granite blocks and fragments of a staircase, but that's pretty much it. The mysterious discovery of Machu Picchu. Nearly everyone knows what Machu Picchu is, or at least they know what it looks like and they know it's in Peru. But even if you're familiar with this great Inca city, you might not know how it was actually discovered, because just over 100 years ago, this was still a lost city, never seen by modern humans. The man who first discovered Machu Picchu was Hiram Bingham, an American adventurer born in Hawaii in 1875. His parents were missionaries and hoped that he would follow in their footsteps, but he didn't. After going to Yale University in 1894, he became fascinated with Latin American history. He married Alfreda Mitchell in 1900, the heiress to the Tiffany jewelry fortune. Well, exploring is expensive. In 1906, he retraced the route Simón Bolívar took through Venezuela and Colombia in the 1820s. He explored trade routes in South America in 1909, following an ancient caravan trail all the way from Buenos Aires to Lima. And in 1911, he went in search of a mysterious lost city. Rumor had been circulating about a lost city for quite some time. It was said to be the last refuge of the Inca people as they fought against their Spanish conquerors in the 1530s. Hiram journeyed to Cusco, traveled on foot through the sweltering heat of the jungle, and then wound up high in the Andes Mountains. And that was when he found Machu Picchu. He spent days climbing up the mountains until he discovered a small hut occupied by a family of peasants. They were shocked to see foreigners and agreed to show Hiram the ruins in the mountains. And that was when he found the Inca stonework of Machu Picchu covered in trees, overgrown with tangles of vines, almost completely blanketed in moss and crowded with bamboo thickets. The Machu Picchu you see today has actually been cleaned and cleared. When it was found in 1911, nobody knew what it was. It didn't have a name, and it was covered in a thick cloud forest. The Great Cholula Pyramid. The Great Pyramid of Cholula is the biggest pyramid in the entire world, currently buried under a mountain in Mexico, with a Spanish church sitting on top of it. You wouldn't even know there was a pyramid simply by looking, since it's all overgrown with grass and trees. The only thing you can see is the church way up at the top, along with the ancient ruins all around its base. The pyramid was built over 2,000 years ago, and it practically dwarfs the Great Pyramid of Giza. Yet the origin of this monument still puzzles archaeologists to this day. It has architectural elements from the Teotihuacan culture as well as from El Tajín civilization, but nobody knows who built it or why it was abandoned. One theory is that the Aztecs were using it and then ran away when the Spanish came, but before they left, they buried the pyramid with dirt to preserve a piece of their culture. Maybe they knew the Spanish were already destroying every piece of indigenous heritage, and so the pyramid was disguised so that it would be preserved if they could ever return. How surprised are you to know the biggest pyramid in the world is actually in Mexico? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. See you soon. Bye!